You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Welcome to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This is a special pre-recorded program for listeners around Australia except 3CR in Melbourne, from which this program is coming to you from. I'm currently in the middle of a radiothon for Community Radio 3CR, where I'm trying to raise $20,000 in the next hour. But we understand that every community radio station in this country has its own financial issues, and you need to raise your own money. So instead of boring you with the Radiothon program here from 3CR in Melbourne, I'll do a special theory program today. Obviously, as this has been pre-recorded, and it'll be broadcast simultaneously with the Radiothon program in Melbourne, from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. Obviously, that I won't be able to comment on current affairs, and who knows, maybe the world is ended before this broadcast is heard. So you wonder what anarchy is all about? An anarchist society is a voluntary, non-hierarchical society based on the creation of political, social and institutional structures which are based on equal decision-making power and equal access to wealth. Why power and wealth? Because it's inequalities in power and wealth which create most of the problems we face today in society. Now, let's look at class in Australia in the 21st century. Now, a lot of people think that class is entrenched in concrete, and the concept of class does not change. As society changes, technology changes, human relationships change. Class, and this is my opinion, is something which changes. And as an activist, if you don't understand the changes which have occurred in society, the message you are trying to get across to people will disappear, will fall on deaf ears. As the Bible says, it will fall on barren ground. Because we need to understand what's going on in society if we wish to change what is happening. If we have no understanding and continue to use analysis which may have been relevant in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, well, then we will be irrelevant. What we have to say will be totally marginalised, and we'll continue to find that we are ineffective. So I'd like to look at the concept of class in 21st century Australia. Now, class in 21st century Australia straddles traditional class analysis. It straddles the concept of white-collar worker, blue-collar worker, professional. It straddles all those concepts. The concepts which we have become used to. Because what determines class in a 21st century capitalist society is totally dependent on disposable income. Not whether you've been to university, not whether you're a white-collar worker, a professional, a blue-collar worker. It's about disposable income. Now, obviously, we're all aware of the 1%. Well, we're all aware of the 0.1% and the 1% who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Why do I use the term 0.1%? Because obviously I'm talking about billionaires. But ultimately, in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, The 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have an extraordinary impact on society that goes far beyond the amount of assets they control. It's not just about controlling assets, it's about controlling the political equation. It's about being able to determine parliamentary policy, not at the point of a gun, but at the fact that they have become, corporations and individuals have become too big to fail in a capitalist society. And we see this over and over again. We saw this during the Banking Royal Commission a few years ago. Institutions in a capitalist society where deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation dominate the economic agenda and political agenda, have an inordinate amount of power in determining policy, parliamentary legislation, laws, which determine how we survive and live in this country. For example, why are 3 million people from a population of 28 million people living on a continent facing food insecurity on a daily basis? Why do we have private charities asking for money to send Australian kids to public schools, which we the taxpayers pay for? I would go, why do one third of Australians live on social security benefits and they live a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits? And the main reason that occurs is because of the structural inequalities. And at the head of those structural inequalities is the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who have extraordinary power that goes beyond the assets they control. So let's put aside the 1%. I assume there's no argument about the 1%. Everybody accepts that. And if you want to break down the 1%, you can break it down to the 0.1%, the billionaires of the world. Now let's look at a second layer. As I said, it's about disposable income, the type of life you lead in a capitalist society, whether it's a hand-to-mouth existence on a day-to-day basis, or it's a life where you can enjoy the good things, in inverted commas, which are provided in a private investment for profit society, are ultimately dependent on the amount of disposable income you have after you've paid for your essential bills. Simple as that. Now, the next group in Australian society, and I'm talking about, the first was the 1%, now I'm talking about the 8%ers. Who are the 8%ers? The 8%ers are what is normally termed the aspirational classes, those who have made it, who have disposable income at the end of the week. Now, many of these 8%ers are not your traditional professional class or white-collar workers or upper middle class or lower middle class or middle class. All types of people in 21st century Australia find themselves in situations where they have disposable income at the end of the week. And this accounts for about 8% of the Australian population. Now, these 8% have grown and prospered over the last 50 years because of a series of laws that have been passed which actually push people into investing, whether it's in stocks and shares, whether it's in housing. We have laws in this country which reward people who have disposable income. They get rewards in terms of taxation, benefits, for buying stocks and shares, for owning more than one home, and the list goes on and on. This is the investment class, and the investment class can include many different so-called members of the professional class and the working class, the traditional working class. You've got some small business people, though most small business people don't have disposable income at the end of the week. You have people in government positions, senior and middle-level government positions, the state and federal and even local government level, who've got disposable income. We're talking about people earning $200,000 to $300,000 a year. And then you have tradespeople. Some work for themselves. Many work for corporations, the mining sector, agriculture, who are part of the investment class. This is a new class, not based on the type of work you do, not based where you live, but based on the amount of disposable income you have at the end of the week and whether you are willing to place this investment income in assets which give you a tax advantage at the end of the day. This is the investment class. And the investment class is important, not just in terms of the fact that they are involved in investing in the community, but in terms of the example they provide to the rest of the community. This is what people aspire to be. They aspire to be part, this is in Australia, they aspire to be part of this class because it means they can enjoy the good things of life in a capitalist society. Then you have the great bulk of the population, about 60%. Now, wages in Australia, most people in Australia are wage earners. They continue to be wage earners, whether they're employed by the state at a local, state or federal level, or whether they're employed by private business or small business. They are wage earners. Now, wage earners are those that find at the end of the week, or at the end of the month, apart from maybe the possibility of enjoying a holiday at the end of the year, taking the family out for a bit of takeaway, or camping, or buying a new car, and at the end of the week, there's nothing apart from what's in the superannuation kitty and a few $1,000s in the emergency fund. So this is your working class. Because at the end of the week, they have no disposable income or minimal disposable income. Because everything they earn goes on paying for the basic necessities of life. The mortgage, the rent, the car, the insurance, the tax, the basic services, energy, telephones, you name it. It goes on and on. So about 60% of the population belong to the working class. And then you have the 30% of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive. People on New Start allowance who may or may not have a future before them. People on old age pensions who've reached the end of their lives, who don't have enough in their superannuation fund, or never had enough, or never had any chance to put money away in their superannuation funds because of the type of employment they pursued. Maybe they were women. They spent most of their life child rearing, which is, not seen as an occupation in this country. Maybe they're people on single parents who find themselves in difficult economic situations, because in this country you need two people working to keep a family together. It's that simple. Maybe you've got a disability, a disability support pension, and although you've tried to find work, it's almost impossible or very hard for a variety of reasons. So there are four distinct classes. Now, obviously, people on Social Security benefits lead a hand-to-mouth existence, and even a major appliance failing causes a huge hiccup in their day-to-day lives. Even the Social Security system recognises this and actually allows people to have small loans which are paid back through their Social Security over a period. So you've got four distinct classes, not based on any traditional idea of the type of work that people do, but based on the amount of disposable income you have at the end of the day. So there's the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, which have an extraordinary impact on society. You have the 8% who are part of the investment class. These are people who earn more than they need to pay for the basic necessities of existence, who can put money aside and then use this country's taxation-friendly laws for investors to invest in housing, stocks and shares. That's about 8% of the population. You could be a school teacher, a senior school teacher. You could be a government bureaucrat. You could be a tradesperson. You could be self-employed. You could be employed in the mining sector. So the investment class is a relatively new class in Australian society, but a fundamentally important class, because this is the class, as I said before, that people aspire to be part of. Nobody aspires to be a billionaire or part of the 1%. This happens through an accident of birth, or it happens because of some innovation that's been created in some corporations that's been set up. It's not happens to everybody. Then you have the great bulk of people, about 60%, who basically are wage earners, maybe wage earners for corporations, wage earners for government entities, wage earners for small business. And at the end of the week, they've paid their bills. They may get a holiday at the end of the year. They get on with their lives. And unless there's unemployment, people trudge on. This is the tradition. You call this the working class. So you've got the 1%, the investment class, the working class. Then you have Social Security beneficiaries as a class, irrespective of the Social Security you receive. And obviously there's a wide difference between somebody on a New Start allowance and somebody on a disability support pension. But the fact is that anybody in a Social Security benefit lives a hand-to-mouth existence. So if you look at Australian society in this way, it gives you a better grasp of what we face. Now, obviously, apart from the economic factors, there are other factors, like nationalism, fear of the unknown, fear of the outsider, and the list goes on and on. But these are outside factors which have impacts on most of society. So this is something that's important. And looking at class in this way allows us to analyse what's happening in society, and allows us to formulate ideas on how to tackle the issues of the growing inequality, which has become a feature of Australian society, irrespective of a landslide win by the Albanese-led Labor government. So let's move on. As I said, today I'm broadcasting at two places at once, through the Community Radio Network which is this program, which is on Theory. And at the same time, I'm broadcasting Community Radio 3CR in Melbourne during the 3CR Radiothon, where I'm trying to raise $20,000 in an hour for community radio station 3CR. But obviously, you'd be listening to this program on your local community radio station, and community radio stations rely on volunteers, they rely on donations, they have their own mechanism via which they subscribe members. And obviously, if you are after independent news and ideas and values and listening to people who don't have a voice on the other media, the legacy media and the corporate-owned media and the government-gilded ABC, well, then I encourage you to contact your local community radio station, the community radio station you're listening to this program to, and offer them your assistance, because you need to be more than a consumer in life in order to be useful. We can all consume, but the ones that make a difference are those who actually participate. But obviously I don't want to be preached here today. There's no point, is there? Preaching. But think of class in that way, and I think you'll find that it's much easier to analyse the society you live in. Much easier to understand the ideas which that tradesperson over there has in comparison to the ideas that a social security beneficiary has somebody who's, is part of the traditional working class. So it's all about disposable income. Now let's look at revenue. Now, whether we like it or not, we live in this country in a capitalist society, and most people around the world live in a variation of a capitalist society, whether it's state capitalism, where the state owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, or corporate capitalism, where unaccountable corporations own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. We all live in a capitalist society in one way or another. And if you don't have access to wealth in a capitalist society, you got problems. That's where there's homelessness, food insecurity, and the list goes on and on. You can't pay your bills, you're in big trouble. Now, people say we live in the most wonderful, egalitarian, sovereign nation state on planet Earth in the history of the human race. And I think to myself, well, that's very nice to think you think that. Very nice. But the reality is a little bit different, isn't it? We live in a society which is plagued by inequality. And as I keep telling people week after week, when you have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools, there's a problem. There's a problem when you've got to step over homeless people because the public housing sector has been privatised. There's a problem when, people on social security benefits live a hand-to-mouth existence. There's a problem where the loss of 6-week wages means bankruptcy and the loss of your home. So there is a problem in a capitalist society. And the problem is there is never enough revenue to go round. Never enough revenue to go round. And why don't we have enough revenue in a country that's as rich as Australia? Well, it's simple. People and organisations and corporations that should pay tax don't pay tax. There are leaners and lifters in society, but unlike the Morrison-led Liberal National Party government and the Abbott-led Liberal National Party government and the Turnbull-led Liberal National Party government, unlike them, we don't think the leaners are people on social security benefits. We know the leaners are transnational, multinational corporations, some locally owned, some overseas owned. They are the real leaners in society. That is why there is a revenue problem. So how to resolve this revenue problem to ensure that there is enough revenue coming into the federal treasury to deal with the day-to-day problems which are faced by an increasing number of people in this community, not just in terms of food insecurity and physical issues, but in terms of the anxiety and issues which more and more Australians are facing. Well, we need to broaden the revenue stream. And when I stood as a candidate, exceptionally unsuccessfully, at the Flinders, in the Flinders electorate during the last federal election, these are issues which I attempted to raise, as I said before, spectacularly unsuccessfully. Things like a 1% financial transaction tax to ensure that we have enough money to provide basic services. Things like a 1% stock market turnover tax. And then if we want a universal basic income, why in this mineral-rich, resource-rich continent on which live only 28 million people from a population of over 8 billion, and I'll repeat it again, 28 million people living on a resource-rich continent with a population of over 8 billion people. Why can't we look after the basic necessities of every human being on this continent? Why can't we provide economic redress to this country's First Nations people? Why can't we look after people on social security benefits? And the list goes on and on. Now, if we want something like a universal basic income, as I spoke about last week regarding the introduction of artificial intelligence, the fact is that we will need a universal basic income, then we need to broaden that income stream to such a degree that we need to either nationalise this country's natural resources or charge maybe 90% tax on profits which derive by corporations which are currently exploiting this country's natural resources. I mean, it's extraordinary that so little revenue returns to this country, to the people of this country, through royalties and taxation, while transnational and local corporations make billions of dollars of profits. These are the very organisations which currently are causing so many issues in our society. Why can't we deal with the climate emergency? Because our resources are owned by these corporations who will fight tooth and nail to continue to exploit fossil fuels, irrespective of the damage they are doing to the planet and the people of this country. Irrespective. Now, if these resources were owned by the people through a nationalisation process, then you could slowly close them down, because profit wouldn't be the major aim, although profit is an important aspect. Another important aspect would be the ability to, be able to change from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy economy in the quickest time with the minimum dislocation. So these are things that we should be thinking about. These are not revolutionary ideas. These are simple, reformist ideas which can be introduced through legislation tomorrow through a simple act of Parliament. It's very simple. This legislation, considering the makeup of the House of Representatives, where the Labor Party, I think, has a 94-seat in a 152-seat Parliament, and the Senate, where it has a majority with the Green senators, they could pass this legislation tomorrow. Tomorrow. Not yesterday, but tomorrow. Simple. So revenue. Revenue is a central issue in a capitalist society.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
Now let's move on. Now, change. The economy. It's not just about wealth distribution. You can have an economy which is destroying the planet, and you can distribute that wealth. Now, we actually, currently in Australia, we have an economy which is destroying the planet, and we're not redistributing that wealth. So we need to look at economic change. Not just in terms of wealth distribution. There's no point having wealth distribution if the economic system which is currently plaguing the planet continues unabated. That we continue unabated to pass legislation, which encourages fossil fuel production as we're seeing today. So the issue is, what type of economy do we want? How do we want to create wealth? Because we are in a situation where we can create wealth. There are technological innovations which allow us to create wealth, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in communication, whether it's in provision of services to people. There's a multitude of technological innovations, some that require artificial intelligence and many that don't. So we need to look at the way we create wealth. And there's no point creating wealth by destroying the goose that lays the golden egg. And the goose that lays the golden egg obviously is planet Earth. It's simple. There's not enough spaceships, irrespective of Mr. Musk's desires to take us to planet Mars and be, his personal slaves. That's not going to occur. Maybe the buffoon will get it right, who knows. But that's another story. So wealth creation. Do we create wealth by allowing corporations to continue to dominate the economic equation in this country? Do we create wealth by doing that? Because that's what we're doing today. We are allowing them to determine the legislative agenda. Governments are kowtowing to private corporations because of the extraordinary amount of power they are able to wield in society, not just in terms of economic power, but in terms of the power to actually mould public opinion, whether it's through the virtual media or the dying legacy media. They have that power. So how do we create wealth? How do you create wealth in a private investment for private profit society without, as I said before, destroying the goose that lays the golden egg, planet Earth? Well, there are a number of ways you can create wealth, and the most important way is to diversify the economy. Now, again, this isn't about bloody revolution. This is about simple parliamentary change. How do you diversify the economy? Currently, economic activity is dominated by the private sector. The privatisation tsunami, which was swept over not just Australia but the rest of the world, has meant that important public assets which were built up through the blood, sweat and tears of generations of Australians have now been sold off. Now, I'm not just talking about the loss of revenue and the loss of services. I'm talking about something more important. The ability of nationalised entities to introduce competition within the economy increases as the amount of public institutions and assets increase. Today, through privatisation, there is virtually no competition in the private sector. If there is no competition in the private sector will maximise profits, irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs, because that's the central element of a capitalist society. Private investment for private profit. You don't make a profit. If you're a publicly listed company, your shareholders desert you, you go into liquidation. You're a small business, you don't make a profit, you close down your small business. You're a large corporation, you don't make a profit, you close down that corporation. It's a simple equation. So the more publicly owned assets we have, whether it's energy, telecommunications, health, infrastructure, and the list goes on and on, the greater the competition with the private sector. Now, at the same time, we need to diversify the economy, because having an economy which is totally controlled by the state or the private sector leads to issues. So we need a third tier of the economy to be built up in this country. And I'm talking about cooperatives and collectives. Now, nobody gets rich in a cooperative and collective. But what a cooperative and collective does, it allows people to have dignified work producing important, essential products. Not products which are based on the concepts of production for production's sake, not products which are introduced to maximise profits, not products which really have no impact on the standard of living of people, but products which provide basic, essential services and goods to the population. Having a strong cooperative and collectivist sector in the economy increases competition between the state sector and the private sector. Now, cooperatives and collectives are a mechanism by which ordinary people can make an extraordinary contribution to the society they live in. But there is one major issue in the 21st century. Everybody needs starting capital in a capitalist society to get things moving. It is very difficult for a cooperative and collective to get enough starting capital to set up a business, even through, crowdfunding, which may occasionally, be successful. In the majority of cases fails. So I'm talking about allocating 1% of superannuation funds to be used as seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives. Now, obviously, many of these cooperatives and collectives will fail, but many more will succeed. So it doesn't mean that this is a 1% contribution by the superannuation sector. What it means is it's an investment by the superannuation sector in providing goods, services and employment to a significant number of the population. Now, the idea of cooperative and collectives is nothing new. It's something which has existed for thousands of years. It's just that in an industrialised society, in a society which relies on artificial intelligence, that it's much more difficult for cooperatives and collectives to gain a foothold in the economic landscape. Now, another thing I'd like to raise, which I continually raise, is the concept of public assets. If there's one thing that we've learnt over the past 50 years during the privatisation tsunami, it's that public assets do not belong to the people. They belong to the state government or the federal government or the local government. And our governments are elected for a limited period of time. but they do have the power constitutionally to divest themselves of assets which have taken generations to build, which provide essential services to millions of people. And we've seen this with the privatisation of the aircraft carrier Qantas, the privatisation of telecommunications through Telecom, the privatisation of Medibank Private, the privatisation of CSL, the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, and I could go on and on. There are many essential services which has been sold off by the government of the day. In order to ensure that public assets remain in public hands, their ownership needs to be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. This would mean that if a state government or a federal government wants to sell off a publicly owned asset, they would have to hold a referendum to find out if the people of that country wanted to sell that asset. And I'm quite confident that every referendum we put up to sell a public asset would fail, because public assets are just that. They are public assets which make life much easier for everyday people in society. So this is another idea that we should be looking at, the way that we make changes in this society. Now, the dilemma with the Australian Constitution, which was adopted in 1901, is simple. The Australian Constitution was designed to ensure that the 6 colonies federated into one state. It took 2 referendums in New South Wales for them to agree to federation, because they didn't want to support the rest of the country economically. So the Australian Constitution is devoid of a significant number of features. Although there was a minority in the constitutional conventions which wanted to incorporate human rights similar to the rights which were in the American Constitution, they were voted down. And there are no real rights that protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power in the Australian Constitution. We have 4 rights constitutionally, and hopefully I remember them. 1 is the right to be compensated fairly if the government seizes our private assets. Compensation. I mean, this has a huge impact in terms of change, in terms of nationalising this country's natural resource, but that's a different issue we can look at. The second right you have under the Australian Constitution is the right of freedom of religion. The third right you have under the Australian Constitution is the right to trial by jury. This is a right which goes back beyond federation in most of the colonies, where since the 1840s and 1850s, juries decided the fate of people in cases that were important, that had profound implications for the individual who found themselves on the dock. Okay? And then the last right, which is quite a kind of a funny little right, is the right not to be discriminated against depending on the state you live in. What that means is that if you live in New South Wales, you can't pass federal legislation which penalises people in Queensland but not New South Wales. This right was put in the Constitution to ensure that when the colonies federated, the major states or the major colonial entities did not negate the rights of individuals. So that's an interesting right, which would be interesting to take to the High Court one day. So this is another. So essentially, the Australian Constitution is nothing more than a document which regulates the relationship between the states and the federal government. And what we've seen over the last 120 years is a small number of changes to the Australian Constitution. Now, in Switzerland, they have citizens-initiated referendums, and in some states in the United States of America, they have the right of recall of non-performing politicians in between elections. In this country, we have no such rights. There is no right to a citizens-initiated referendum. You could get 10 million people to sign a petition to hold a referendum, and the government of the day could say, yep, no, sorry, piss off. No rights in terms of that. So the way the Constitution can be altered in this country is quite difficult. Firstly, it's the government of the day that has a majority in both houses of Parliament, which is the only entity which can put a question to the Australian people in the Constitution. Secondly, the question that's been put to the Australian people has to be passed by 4 of the 6 states and a majority of people in the country for that decision to be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So changes to the Australian Constitution are exceptionally difficult. They've been made difficult for a variety of reasons, and the main reason was to sustain the status quo. So although the Constitution was, came about in 1901, 124 years later, we still have the same constitutional arrangements and the same arrangements by which to change the Constitution. This is another debate that we should have. But we don't have these type of debates anymore. We don't have these debates about constitutional change because we're told that constitutional change is impossible. Well, constitutional change is possible and has occurred, I think, on 11 separate occasions in this country. And it occurred in 1967 where the Commonwealth government, the federal government, was given the right to legislate for Indigenous Australians because for the previous, 70 years since Federation, Indigenous Australians were ignored, marginalised, criminalised by various state entities. It was only when the federal government took over Aboriginal affairs that this occurred. Just after World War II, a proposition was put to the Australian people that the Commonwealth government became responsible for the provision of most of pensions. That was passed quickly by the Australian people because they saw the benefit to them as a society having pensions to actually be obtained through the Commonwealth government, centralising this. Then we have taxation powers, which has been centralised in the government of the day. They're the only ones who can, introduce income tax. Before the Second World War, it's the states which had the power to impose income tax. So constitutional change is possible, but it's only possible in Australia if there is pressure from the people to hold a particular referendum. And unlike the Voice referendum, which the Albanese-led Labor government failed to have the Australian people's support because it was not willing to deliver a legislative framework by which to incorporate the Voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution. The fact that it was an open question allowed opponents to the Voice in Parliament to raise issues regarding it which had nothing to do with the proposition itself. So, change is possible. Change is possible. But it's only possible when there is pressure from below. The Whitlam-led Labor government introduced more significant reforms, including the formation of Medicare, which is the forerunner of Medibank, which is the forerunner of Medicare, which is one of the central pillars of Australian society today. okay? It introduced reforms in terms of divorce, reforms in terms of pensions, reforms in terms of community radio stations, community television stations. And all these reforms didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of a popular movement in the late 60s and early 70s for change, for reforms to a fossilised system which was based on ideas which are no longer relevant in the late 1960s and 1970s. If it wasn't for that mass movement of people forcing governments to introduce reforms, none of these reforms would have been made. In 2025, we have the opposite problem. We have a Labor government which has a significant majority in the House of Representatives and can pass radical legislation or reformist legislation any time it likes through the House of Representatives, through the Senate, refusing to act because it is concerned about the reaction of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. This is utter garbage. What's the point of being in Parliament if you are not actually able to use that significant majority to introduce significant change? The Whitlam-led Labor government in the 70s didn't have enough, didn't have a huge majority, but they were able to push forward a radical reformist agenda because of the support of the Australian people. Obviously, things have changed in the last 50 years. They've changed radically. And they've changed in terms of people being incorporated into the system through by being financially bound to the system. So issues are important. But what's more important is our ability to understand the type of society we live in. That's why I think it's important that we adopt this new class analysis, because it's a class analysis which is based on disposable income, because it allows us to easily understand the type of society we live in and gives us the ability to promote change. Now, I do know that personality-based politics is important, but what we've forgotten over the last 50 years is that if we do not have significant economic change, any change which hinges on one specific idea can be removed at any particular time. Thank you for listening to this special pre-recorded program of the Anarchist World this week. To all those listeners and community radio stations around Australia, I encourage you to contact your local community radio station, see if they need any help. They're always looking for volunteers. There's always things to do in a community radio station. Currently, I'm at the end of my Radiothon program on Community Radio 3CR. Hopefully we've got somewhere towards raising $20,000 to keep Community Radio 3CR on air for another year. And hopefully you'll be able to contribute to your local community radio station, if not in terms of volunteering, not in terms of participation, maybe in offering some financial support to what are still significant community assets. And that's the key, isn't it? Community radio stations are not owned by the state. They're not owned by private corporations. They're owned by you for a variety of means. So participation is a fundamental requirement in any volunteer-based, community-based organisation. Without participation, whether it's actions on the street, whether it's been part of a committee, whether it's volunteering, nothing changes. Ultimately, change comes from you. I encourage you in 2025 to get involved, not just with your local community radio station, but with activities in your part of Australia. The more of us that become involved, the more of us, the more change whether it's reform or radical change, is possible. Thank you once again for listening to this special edition of the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489 and join public interest before corporate interests online by going to info@pibci.net. Next week, it won't be a pre-recorded program. I'll be able to, analyse what's happening in the world today, whether you agree with me or not. Isn't that important? What's important is that you hear different ideas and ultimately you can make up your own mind about whose analysis is closest to the mark and what suits you. Thank you once again for listening to this special Anarchist World, pre-recorded Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. Listen in next week.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.